Alrighty, well, officially, hello everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Welcome to Concordia University's fourth space. Thank you so much for joining us for this panel on housing in the Global South, whereby we'll examine trends and global implications. To help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube live from fourth space, which is located on unceded Indigenous lands here in Jogé, Montreal. And at fourth space, in the space that we're in now, we work with our university community to mobilize and exchange knowledge, really by co-creating daily activities and panel conversations such as this one. So it's our great pleasure to collaborate with Concordia University public scholars. Today, of course, we're working with Hone Mandefro, who is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology here at Concordia, and of course, all of his panelists, his guests, who will be introduced shortly for this event. So we're really excited to hear from all of you and to join in this conversation. If you're joining us via Zoom and you'd like to make comments or questions during a Q&A, we do invite you to just raise a virtual hand and we'll be able to call upon you. Or if you have any reflections you'd like to pop into the chat, you're more than welcome to do so, and we'll all see that. Okay, that's it for me. I think I'll pass it over to you. Hone, welcome.
Thank you, Anna. Hello, everyone. Well, good morning for those of you in Montreal, and good evening in Addis and South Africa, where at least two of our speakers have joined. My name is Hone Mandefro again, and I'm a Ph.D. candidate, and my research is about the housing program in Addis Ababa. It's called the Integrated Housing Development Program. And I'm looking at how the people that have been relocated to those condominium flats a decade ago, how they have described their experience of living in these new spaces, and particularly how their social life has been impacted by that relocation. And which is why I think today's topic on housing is important for me personally, but also I think for the conversation broadly about housing and its related social processes. So as all of you know, rapid urbanization in the global south has led into a challenge of meeting increasing housing demand. In fact, by 2050, some estimates indicate that the urban population in the global south will double, while as the urban area in the global south will triple. And that is a lot of it is driven by population growth, but also increasing number of migrants from rural areas that are flocking into urban areas seeking, employment opportunities and better life more broadly. So today's panel is intended to explore these dynamics and basically take the housing in the global south, the global south as a category, and ask, what are the major trends in housing issues in the global south, and what are the implications of these trends, not just for the countries in the global south, but more broadly for the worldwide, I guess, scale. And to explore this question, we're joined by four distinguished panelists, speakers. And to begin with, the person who braved Montreal's cold weather this morning and joined us at the fourth space here at Concordia in person, Professor Gabriel Foun, who is a professor in the Department of Geography and we're also affiliated with the Center for Asian Studies of the University of Montreal. From Ethiopia, we're joined by Robel Eshwas. If you can wave Robel, just for people to know you. Thank you. So Robel is the Vice President of the Ethiopian Urban Planners Association. He holds a bachelor's degree in urban and regional planning and a master's degree in housing and sustainable development from Addis Ababa University. Robert also serves as the head of urban planning department at MTT Consulting Architects and engineers firm in Addis Ababa. From South Africa, we're joined by Alison Tashunga, who is head of research and market intelligence at the Center for Affordable Housing in Africa. She has more than 10 years experience in the public sector and has areas of interest including human settlement policies and programs, intergovernmental finance, and public expenditure analysis. And lastly, from the Netherlands, we're joined by Antoinette Tesfaye. I guess perhaps before I go, Alison, if you can wave for those of us in the space to know you.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. And Antena is a PhD candidate at the University of Delft. Before moving to the Netherlands for his PhD studies, Antena practiced architecture and planning in Ethiopia, and he lectured at Addis Ababa University's institute, AIBC, Ethiopian Institute for Urban Building and Construction, I believe. But Antena, if you can wave in your hand. Okay.
Hello. It's a complicated name, EIABC, Ethiopian Institute of Architecture, Building Construction and City Development. Quite complicated.
Thank you. Yeah, and often goes by AIBC, so I didn't know what that long name meant, but thank you for that. So just to start us off, I think I would ask all of the speakers the same question, which I alluded earlier. And based on your research and experience, what are the major trends in relation to housing in the global south? And perhaps if I can start from you, Professor.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for welcoming me in this panel, inviting me in this panel. It's quite a really difficult question because it's really difficult to address housing issues in the global south, because there is plenty of situations and different kind of context, of course. When you told me 1 week ago that you will ask this question to all panelists, I tried this morning to find a very short answer to it. And clearly, to begin the conversation, I see three things from what I've been able to study, mainly in Southeast Asia, but also here in Montreal. First, for the global south in general, clearly, there is the fight for better housing. I think it's still on. Now, we didn't really tackle the issue of access to better housing for the poorest part of the population in the global south. We still have a very broad estimation of more than 1 billion people that living in slum areas, and much more that have difficulties to access to better housing. So from that constatation, very broad one, I think we have to ask ourselves, and this is a second point, if all of the transformation of the big approach, especially from international institutions and the international community about how to grant better access to housing in the global south, all of those changes that have begun at the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s, and all of this push for greater housing commodification, what is the result today? Were we able to grant better access to housing through this push for greater commodification and privatization of the urban production or not? And I think that according to the numbers, we can say that this has been a big failure all over the world. And maybe it has been more failure in specific part, we have different contexts, as I said, but in general, this greater push for commodification of housing in the global south, the fact that we made the choice of relying on the markets instead of on public policies to produce housing for the poorest is a big failure. A third important thing in all of this is, I think that slum dwellers and informal dwellers we continue to see them in most part of the global south as illegal inhabitants and as a problem, as a source of many problems in urban areas, such as criminality, I don't know, political instability, etc. And this shows that we haven't been able to change a mind and change the general point of view about about informality. And even if we have been, even if many kind of programs have tried to integrate those inhabitants into what we are calling the formal city in different ways, they are still seen as a problem. And this is something that emphasizes a bigger issue about access to housing, but we will talk about that later. And maybe a fourth point, just to conclude about that, another big change that is a direct consequence of this big push for commodification is that housing struggle and housing fight have changed because of the introduction between power relations between inhabitants and the state. Before the 80s and the 90s, the state was seen as the main provider of housing for people, right? With the privatization, a new stakeholder have come into the scene and have occupied the center stage of that housing scene since then. This is the private stakeholder, and now housing fight and the claim for better housing is between those three kind of, and the three broad categories of actors: public ones, inhabitants, but also the private stakeholders. And as everywhere in the world, the position of the state here have changed, clearly due to the big neoliberalization of the economy. The state is clearly supporting not housing policy anymore, but more a private stakeholder and their interest. So these have changed housing fights on the ground for sure, and there is an ongoing recomposition, reworking of those power relations between all of the actors that are actually involved in housing issues in the global south. But once again, it's different according to the different economic context. So maybe we can continue the conversation also about those diversities of context.
Thank you. That was a good overview of, I think, the trend is at the global south. And I think it's important to highlight the category of the global south is, while it holds potential in bringing major trends across these countries, yeah, diversity is widespread between these countries, and I would say even within countries. And I think particularly to your point about the role of the state, maybe we should go to Ethiopia, where the government has recently taken an active role by constructing and distributing houses, supposedly for lower and middle income people, but there's a conversation about affordability. So maybe I'll go to Robel, and Robel, if you can give us your response, perhaps tying it into your observation about the integrated housing development program in Ethiopia.
Okay, thank you very much. Like you said, talking about the global south and the issues, and to unpack it, I mean, the global south does not have a uniform identity, characteristics, or trends, so it's very hard to generalize it, but we use mostly inductive reasoning, to talk about the trends. But I'll be using, like you said, the cases in Ethiopia or in generic in Africa to talk about the different patterns. So to begin with the trends in Africa or in Ethiopia, one of the key elements or one of the key things that we see in housing is the transformation of housing, the transformation of settlements and people in general. When we start with the urban areas or these cities, like you said, the government plays a major role in this transformation. So the private sector in Africa is focusing mostly on upper middle class and luxury houses or modern houses. They're trying to bring this modernity, luxurious houses to different upper class people, and they're trying to sell them. I mean, they're not investing a lot of money in research, in terms of design, in terms of material, in terms of different aspects. So what they're trying to sell is this modernity or Western way of life. And because they're now spending a lot of resources on how to build them, on materials, in order to create that Western way of life or Western type of housing, they have to rely mostly on imports or imports of material. That makes it expensive, which is unsustainable, and which is unscalable. So the government is trying to intervene in order to fulfill, or in order to bring housing to the lower and middle class people. The challenge with it is that, again, the government is not spending a lot of money or resources on how to approach them. Of course, there's always the question of how do we measure it. In the last 15 years, the government has provided over 300,000 houses in Addis alone. This is a huge number if you look at it in terms of just the number of housing. But there is always the question that the government have not really created an affordable housing. One, two, they created this housing in the outskirts of the city. So we have this problem in which we refer to these agricultural lands in which many people live in Africa, many people live in the global south, I'll say. The government usually refer to them as bare lands, these agricultural lands. And there are farmers living in these areas, and it has created tension among them to the point where it led to ethnic arrest, different clashes, or even toppling the government. But the condominium housing in itself is not in any way fulfilling fulfilling the demand that the city or even the country has. So we still see challenges, but the government uses them in order to showcase the products for election campaigns. So it's very hard to find a measurable indicators, I would say.
Thank you, Robel. I think you highlighted a number of pointers, one of them being how the construction materials of housing, particularly in these developing countries, are imported from many global north countries, creating a dependency, essentially, an economic purpose, more than that, dependency between the south and the north. But also, I think the fact that, as was mentioned in Ethiopia, the poor people are increasingly pushed out of the center to the peripheral parts of these countries and major cities, and that's making life unaffordable because of transportation and all that. Yeah, thank you for that. Perhaps we will go to Antana to continue the conversation about Ethiopia, or even at a larger scale, and then we'll come back to Alison to look at the African scale, I guess. Antana, can you give us your response to the same question of what are the major trends in relation to housing in the global south?
Yes, thank you for having me. I have a technical question. Is it possible to share a few slides? Because I have composed my response to this in a certain format.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that should be possible. But I would say, in the meantime, let's go to Alison, and then we'll come back to you. Alison, again, the same question of major trends and purpose. I think maybe you can give us a bit of introduction to the center as well. I think the center does an important work.
Absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity. I actually had a couple slides as well, which would make it easier. So can I just go ahead and share the screen?
Yes.
Okay, let me do that.
I think I did. Should I stop?
Do you want to? Sorry.
No, it's fine. I was trying. I was trying it out. Hone, would you like for me to continue, or should I?
Yeah, that was what we saw was your slide, right? So I guess we can continue with what you saw, what you showed us. Yeah.
Great.
Is it? Yeah. Is it visible?
Yes.
Right. Thank you for having me in this panel. What I wanted to introduce to this question, in response to this question, is a recent policies. It's not a major, let's say, portion of my research, but what I have tangentially looked at. The policy in Addis Ababa City Administration as a case. So I will be expanding possibly to a larger discussion, but I would be telling the story of specific 2 projects which will highlight some new trends that the city is following. Some couple of years ago, they proposed 5 modalities of development in housing, and one of them was the public-private partnership for community development, but also housing development. In this case, I will be talking about these 2 projects. One of them on the left side is a housing project close to a river in an area called Saratanya Safar in Addis Ababa. And on the right side, it's a Federal Housing Corporation's housing project in the Gergi area. Both of them constructed by Ovid Construction, a private construction company. On the left side, the housing project that you see is a gift that the construction company has given for the community there as a housing reconstruction. Because the existing context before this construction happened was a dilapidated situation and precarious because of the proximity to the river and overflow of the river and so on. So this is an intervention from the private construction company, but through the facilitation and moderation of the Addis Ababa City Administration. But on the right side, you see a project that the same company is commissioned to develop rather high-end housing projects. I will go quickly through some of the images that we can see. For example, in this, in terms of materiality, temporal materials, relatively better organized space than that was existing prior to this redevelopment of the housing on Saratanya Safar. Interior spaces with some provision of infrastructure like provision utilities, water, electricity, and relatively improved living conditions. But then also on the other side, we also see these projects that I just described earlier. I find these 2 projects symbolize a new approaches than what Robel just described as the condominium housing projects, which I think is something in between these 2 in terms of intensity, scale of project, and approach. And these are indications. They are not by no means solutions, I would say. Indications of new explorations in the public-private partnership arena. But the question still remains, how are people seeing their housing environments or communal lives? And I have further questions than answers to you today. But I guess I have given some insights into what elements of what is happening currently strike my curiosity to follow where this follows go. I mean, where these policies go and how they can be part of larger discussion as to how to finance, but also how to, from different angles, evaluate housing projects as it goes. Thank you.
Thank you, Antena. I think this is good to see pictures, but also I think it brings up some of the challenges in many African countries and elsewhere about affordability is an issue. How do you finance housing for the lower people, for the lower income and middle income people? So I guess we'll come back to that question in a bit, but maybe we can now go to Alison and hear her response as well.
Sure, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. I'm with let's see, can you see the screen?
Yes.
Yes, let me just project. There we go. I'm with the Center for Affordable Housing Finance in Africa. We're a think tank that is located in Johannesburg in South Africa. And we work all across the African continent. We're about 10 years old or so. We do produce this flagship publication, which I think is what you referred to earlier, called the Housing Finance in Africa Yearbook, which has profiles of every country on the continent. We produce it annually, and it covers property markets with a focus on affordable housing. So what I'll share is a few of the insights that we take from the data collection that is done through that publication. So I think just in terms of the bigger context for affordable housing markets in Africa, there's a series of maps here that are heat maps according to different indicators. The left-hand side is the GDP per capita. And you can see that we have historically low growth across Africa, except for a few countries. And of course, COVID has had a big hit on that. And certainly in sub-Saharan Africa, we're having a difficulty coming back from that. At the same time, Africa is dealing with very high urbanization rates, which I think is a key trend to contextualize this entire discussion, because it has so much to do with housing and with planning and with meeting basic needs. So in some countries, we're seeing very high urbanization rates as households move into the city for economic opportunities. And if those cities are not able to plan for that influx through the formal system, then we see a proliferation of informal settlements or slums. And that is exactly what we're seeing across the continent. And of course, COVID-19 has put a serious strain on the situation in most of these countries. We're seeing higher growth rates in the last year, but that's usually off of a low base. But you can see as well that the urban population living in the slums, that's the green map there, is very high in some countries. And in some places, you're seeing an informal sector that is much larger than the formal sector. So when we speak about the formal sector, we're missing out on most of the delivery mechanism for housing in Africa. If we want to actually talk in scale about how houses are delivered, then we need to speak about the informal sector and about incremental building, which I'll speak to just now. Our latest yearbook focused on climate change, coming off of the conference in Egypt. And I think there's a couple really important connections to make between the housing challenge and climate change as well. So I think traditionally you've seen alternative building technologies seen as an expensive add-on to housing delivery, as opposed to understanding that climate change and the environmental concerns are absolutely interwoven with the housing sector and with the value chain all across the board. So in Africa, we've seen unprecedented numbers of climate emergencies. This graph in the lower left is the number of emergencies. So it's floods and wildfires and droughts. And you can see undeniably that that number is going up in the last few years. The key point here is that the impact of those emergencies and natural disasters is disproportionately impacting low-income households. So when we have a flood, when we have a wildfire, when there's a drought, the impact on housing and affordable housing specifically is very large, and is larger than other segments of the population in terms of income. So we'll see displacement, further urbanization. So if there's a link, of course, between climate change and urbanization, if you're seeing lower agricultural productivity due to droughts, or you're seeing flooding and towns are not able to build back, then those inhabitants of smaller towns will move into the cities and give up a life in a rural area. So climate change is really pushing urbanization, which is already at a high rate across Africa. So in terms of some of the key challenges, I'll be brief. I think one of the key points first to notice, and we did speak about land, is bulk services and infrastructure capacity. So in a lot of cases, the underlying infrastructure to deliver basic services is not present. And so a housing project and a developer will need to incorporate that and install the infrastructure themselves and the connecting infrastructure, which of course brings up the cost of the units, right? So that's one of the issues. The other is that across Africa, we see fairly weak titling and land use management systems. So if we don't have a clear titling system, if title deeds are not enforced, if they're not in place, if coverage is not there, then it's very difficult for the market to function and for the resale market to function. In terms of construction and management capacity, there are, of course, private developers, but most of those are developing smaller projects. There are the massive projects, some of them which we saw that are delivering large developments with support of the public sector. But transportation becomes an issue because if land is cheaper on the outskirts of the city, then it's easier to build larger developments on the outskirts, but then we have not assisted low-income households because they'll then be spending more on public transport and more time getting into jobs, getting into the city to access jobs and schooling. I think the key point that we see inevitably every year in the yearbook is that the majority of housing, we speak a lot about the formal sector and about housing developments, and we take pictures of projects like this on this slide. But the majority of housing across the continent is delivered by households themselves. It's self-built and it's done incrementally. So you're not buying, very few households are going to be buying a new house. Very few can afford that. What is happening is that households are slowly, they're putting down the foundation and then they put in a main room. And then a couple of years later, when they have the funds, they add another room, they improve the roof. So it's an incremental process. And our financing systems need to support that. Instead of assuming that you're getting a off-the-shelf unit from a developer and using a mortgage to access that purchase. The other key trend that I think is important to raise here is small-scale landlordism. So often in informal settlements or in the inner city, you will see entrepreneurs that are renting out a room or adding a room on the back and renting it out. And that is a really important opportunity and a sub-market that needs to be supported. Not the least of the reasons why is that in many cases, those landlords are women, and it's an additional income source. And generally, in terms of housing finance, you have very thin mortgage markets across Africa for a number of reasons. You don't have the institutions and the enabling environment for and the financial sector built up enough, mature enough for the mortgage market to thrive. It's large in South Africa. But on the whole, across the continent, housing finance is through non-mortgage instruments. So through housing microfinance and other means or savings from households. And then I think the on-the-ground capacity of a municipality is also a key factor in delivery. So even if the state doesn't play a role of subsidization or through a PPP, delays in planning approvals and other ways that cities can make the red tape very difficult for developers also slows down delivery. Just to share one slide, which I think might be a useful addition to this conversation. We collect, for the yearbook process, we collect data from all 54 countries across the region every year. We use local consultants for that process. And one of the indicators that we've created at CAF and that we've been tracking for a number of years now is the cost of the cheapest newly built house by a private developer in the country. So this is not the theoretical price, this is the actual price. If you wanted to go out in the market and buy a new house from a private developer, what is the cheapest house that you could buy on the market in that year in an urban area from a private developer, not from public housing? We track that indicator, and then what we do is we compare it to income. So we try to look at affordability. So if the cheapest newly built house is a certain, the lowest The lowest price that we found for the last 2-3 years has been in Nigeria. It's a house that's built by the Millard Fullard Foundation outside of Abuja, supported by the Family Homes Fund. And it's around $9,000, $9,000 to $10,000. But the ranges go up to 80,000, 60,000 across the continent. And the picture you can see, sorry, on the left-hand side of the screen for 2022 is a heat map showing the cost of that cheapest newly built house by a private developer. The hotter the colors, the more expensive. So you can see that the key point here, of course, is comparing that to incomes. So if you took the prevailing mortgage terms in a country, the prevailing mortgage rates, the loan to value ratio, et cetera, and you applied that, so as you assumed that a household was using the mortgage to purchase that cheapest newly built house, what percent of the population could buy that house? And you can see that it's very small. The map on the right-hand side shows the percent of urban households who could afford a house that was at about $9,000 US, which is in most years is the lowest that we can go. So I think one of the things that this shows, and I'll wrap up here, one of the key points is that we rely on the formal sector, and we speak a lot about the formal sector in terms of meeting the housing challenge across the continent, but developers are not able to go down market enough to get to the large part of the population that needs adequate housing. And as a result, you either need to look at rental market, or you need to be looking at incremental building, or we need to be talking about strengthening the resale market and formalizing the resale market. Let me stop there, honey. I hope that's useful.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alison. That was a very important overview of the trends in Africa. And I think I really appreciate the data point as the center uses to kind of compare the situation in multiple countries at Africa level. I think that's a good way of doing comparison in terms of the housing market. But I just want to come back to Gabriel, and you wrote about the condominium becoming much more common form of housing in Cambodia, I believe, and Vietnam perhaps. And I was just curious, now that we have laid out the market dynamics and the bigger trends, what all this mean in the context of people's daily life at neighborhood scale? That could be the way people relate with the state, or they relate with people who live next door. How that what do you call increasing use of condominium as a primary form of settlement affect this relationships vis-a-vis the state or with people who live next?
Yeah, it's big question as well, but I think that what Alison showed, it's really, really important because it's partly answers to the question of can private developers or can the private markets actually give, must be the primary answer to housing access, and what Alison showed is clearly the answer is not. The work on condominiums, it's not only about condominiums. Condominiums, it's one of the many different kind of newly commercially built private real estate projects that are increasing in many parts of the global south. But clearly, from the point of view of private developers, because I worked a lot with private developers, and clearly, it's not you cannot make a lot of benefits when you are building a project if you are selling it to the poorest part of the population. So the main driving force of the production of this new kind of formal real estate project is that they are mostly dedicated to the richest part of the population, or sometimes for the middle class, but mainly for the elites. And clearly, this has also pushed the development of the financialization of households and the economy as well, which is another big issue. But one of the results of this is that the political discourse about housing access and housing affordability have changed all over the Global South since the past 2 or 3 decades. Now, if you don't have access to a proper house or to private ownership, it's not the result of the failure of a public policy, but it's your own problem and your own fault, because you have not managed to actually find a way to improve your socioeconomic level or condition, and your fault is now put under the shoulder of the individual households. And here comes the discourse of private developers, which articulate with the responsibility of individuals to actually find a way to access to proper housing, and mostly through private freehold ownership, which has also been now a dominant discourse that we hear all over the Global South. So this bigger transformation about the discourse on the relation between individuals, socioeconomic progressions in their lives, and housing is clearly pushed also by private developers and the private sectors, because it's a way also for them to prove to consumers that if they are able to buy something in their project, then it will represent for them a good trajectory for their lives, and it's kind of a discourse to bring more consumer and to bring some more people that will actually buy some houses in their project. So I'm getting in very different direction here, but what I'm trying to say, I think, is that the fact that governments are relying more and more on the private sector, and I totally agree with Alison on this, make us forget that there is actually other kind of production of housing, incremental ones, yes, by the informal sector, but actually in most part of the world, they know how to build houses. They have their own solution, and we prefer now to hear the solution from the formal sector rather than the solution from actually the people who have extended knowledge over housing issue and housing problem and how to resolve it. And this have been a dominant thinking since the past 70 years, and this has not changed actually. So this is one of the big issues to tackle. It's a kind of a mindset that we have to change.
Thank you for that. I think, again, coming back to the issue of the role of government vis-a-vis other actors, and I see, Alison, you were going to say something. Maybe you can go ahead, but also I was wondering, now that the center has been documenting affordability and the challenges in there, I was curious to hear more about what specific suggestions you have for government, particularly in improving housing market, both from the demand and the supply side. And I think you've made the point that we have to recognize the role of the informal market and the role of incremental housing and all that. But still, for a number of reasons, governments are interested in controlling the housing sphere, if not the housing market, for political reasons, among other things. So what is the appropriate role the government should play in the housing market, particularly in the finance market? If you can respond to that, and make your point. Maybe before you go, I want to remind the people on the Zoom or here, you can type in your questions. I think shortly we'll give chance to people to ask questions. So you can type in or you can get ready to ask your questions. I just want to make that practical announcement. Please go ahead, Alison.
Sure, thanks. I showed you the indicator of the cheapest newly built house by a private developer. And certainly the data shows us that the majority of African households cannot afford to purchase that house with a bond. But the takeaway that we take from that is not that you therefore can't rely on the private sector and the government must do it. I would not support that. And I would explain why. I mean, where I'm sitting in South Africa, which is a very unique example of government delivery of housing. So since 1994, there was a massive effort to build houses and to provide them free of charge to eligible households who have little to no income. And the government to date has built nearly 4 million houses across the country. It's a huge public investment, absolutely huge. And it's fully subsidized houses that are built and handed over to households for free. Now, I think that is probably at the far end of the spectrum of the role of the state, right? That's the state as a developer going all the way through to turnkey development, right? It hasn't worked. It's very clear that the approach to housing in South Africa is no longer viable. It was decided upon in 1994 as part of a political agreement. But there's been a number of issues since then, and it's become very clear that the role of the state has to shift. It's absolutely necessary, and it needs to shift towards the market and towards private sector. That's for a number of reasons. One of them is you can't build enough houses fast enough if government's doing it. Full stop. You can't do it, right? Government does not have the efficiency to do that. The second reason is that spatially, if you're going to deliver that many houses that are fully subsidized, land is a major cost, and you're going to build units that are outside on cheap land, outside of the city. And then what we have is a terrible legacy where the housing developments have actually perpetuated apartheid in some systems, in a sense, right? We're not in any way contributing to spatial integration at all. In fact, we've made it worse. And then I think the third thing is that ultimately poor households don't want houses, right? They want an income earning opportunity, right? They want to be able to make choices. So one of the things that we've seen is we build 4 million housing units, and a lot of them, the household that received it that has no income sells it immediately and moves back into the informal settlement, because it's better located, it's closer to their families, it's closer to economic opportunities, right? Or they use the house and rent it out. So what they needed was an income. So the delivery model of government being the developer and passing along a fully subsidized unit, I do not think that's a good role. We're actually doing some research right now at CAF about the appropriate role of the state. And we're going to be looking at the full spectrum and trying to understand what are the factors that should be brought into consideration to determine what the most appropriate, effective role of the state is in a given country at a given time. And I think the basic argument is that that role needs to change as the financial sector matures, as the country develops and has more money. And as the institutions are in place. So for example, if you have a very poor country, then the role of the state can only be providing basic services. You can't even talk about the state providing a house, right? There's not enough funds. So certainly in South Africa, what we're seeing now is there's got to be a shift towards working with the private sector and having the role of the state be to create that enabling environment. And in some cases, that means getting out of the way. So your small entrepreneurs, your micro developers, often they won't formalize their additional room or their additional units that they're going to rent out, because dealing with the municipality is too much of an issue. It's too much of a hassle. It's too expensive, right? So those units then are not in compliance with building codes, merely because the state has not made their systems efficient and streamlined enough to support that market. And I think what we're seeing though, right now, yes, the cheapest newly built house is not affordable to most households. But that having been said, there's tremendous, over the last 5 to 10 years, I would argue that we've seen a lot of evidence of increased investor interest in the affordable housing sector and in going down market. And CAF has recorded a lot of instances of that. And there's a number of ways that that can happen. I mean, there's instruments that housing microfinance can assist with that. Rent to buy schemes are a fantastic opportunity that we can explore further to make sure that households have the credit worthiness to then access the bond and to move into ownership. Affordable rental is another really important space for investors. So I think there's great opportunity in Africa for investment into affordable housing by the private sector. And what we need to do is to figure out the appropriate role of the state to support that. Because if government tries to do it alone, it won't work.
Thanks so much. I guess that's the heart of this discussion is often, and it becomes ideological to a certain extent, where we require affordability, efficiency from the government for housing, but there are a number of aspects of our life where the government is not really efficient, but still we give it because it's a public what do you call a public common issue. So I guess that leads us into a discussion that tends to be a bit of more of argumentative rather than empirical. But I think your point, Alison, about the government's efficiency and the challenge, that is the same observation in Ethiopia as well. There are a number of observers at this point saying, maybe the government should consider more role for private sector rather than investing a large amount of money on building, constructing, and all that. Which I guess at this point it might be good to hear from maybe first from Robel and then Antona, just any reaction you might have on the pointers that have been said so far. And yeah.
Okay, so a lot of good points have been mentioned here. Alison, I've mentioned that the government in Ethiopia, at the beginning of 20 years ago, the government was trying to fulfill the demand that housing has, but right now they're understanding that they cannot really fulfill the demand, the housing demand in Addis or in the whole country. But I'd like to make 3 points because the academics right now is saying, so we're talking about rapid urbanization, right? We're talking about the housing demand, the population grows in urban cities, in major urban cities, albeit in smaller towns. But one of the ideas that is being mentioned is to actually go back a little bit further. Because this rapid urbanization, of course, there is a natural population growth, but it is also happening because of a migration from the rural area. So one of the ideas that we're trying to develop is, what can we do in the rural areas? What are the reasons that people are being pushed out? So rural areas, as you all might know, they depend on local materials and agricultural livelihood to live their life. But over the last few decades, we have seen a rapid population growth in which farmers, the new generation, needed more agricultural lands. So Alisa was talking about climate change, and one of the contributors of the climate change is that farmers are now expanding into the natural environment to create more agricultural land. And when you try to, this is leading to deforestation. This is leading to environmental catastrophe. So people cannot really, or we can say that the environment to some extent in certain areas have reached this carrying capacity. So people are actually being pushed off of these agricultural lands, of this rural land. Now this is one of a major issue. The other one is, even in rural housing, we tend to think of this static that is not really changing. But right now, they used to be constructed using mud, thatchet, and different locally available materials. But even that is becoming very impossible for them to access. It's very expensive to find thatchet right now in rural areas in Ethiopia. It's very hard to find wood in Ethiopia to build their houses. So even in rural areas, people are shifting, trying to find a mass developed housing infrastructure or materials, such as metal sheet for roof, such as concrete in order to use for different structure. So this is one of the trends we see in rural housing. So the attempts either by government or by academics in order to rethink what we can do in this approach is one of the thing is the government is trying to rethink a way that these rural houses are not really connected to any form of infrastructure system, be it electricity, be it water supply system. So they're trying to think a way of how can we inject or how can we supply an infrastructure system. You have to understand, for example, in Ethiopia, 78% of the population is a rural dweller. That is almost 90 million people out of 120 million people. So the government is trying to think if we can supply infrastructures to them, they can create a way in which they can rely not only on agriculture but on something else to live or as a livelihood. So one of the attempts or one of the ideas of rethinking these rural areas is using this system. But of course, there is also, I mean, they have to rely on agriculture. The natural environment is degraded. So what can we do? And the second aspect, which is being pushed by mostly academics, is that we need to think the overall settlement patterns of these rural areas. They're mostly scattered all over the natural topography. It's very hard to connect them to infrastructure. So we need to find a way in which we can densify this pattern of the settlements into smaller communities so that we can inject infrastructure, so that we can supply them different services, so that we can create an efficient way of living. So this is one of the major trends in housing in Ethiopia. The second part, Alison also mentioned about the self-built or incremental housing. We have to mention that in Addis or in major cities or towns in Ethiopia, the biggest rental market can be accessed in these self-incremental or self-built houses. So what people do is they slowly, they will have a land, they will build a small house, and over decades they will increase one room or a floor as their family grow, as their income grows. And what they do is they rent out these rooms to different people that is looking for them. So the majority of this, we talk about governmental housing, we talk about private sector development, but the majority of this migrated people look for housing in these areas, in these self-built or incremental built houses in order to rent a room. We're seeing trends in which there is so much pressure in them that they're getting even expensive, even for these migrants or the people. So people are renting a room and living at a room that is very like 20 or 16 meters square. 20 people are living in them, which is creating a huge problem in urban equality and in many aspects. Now, even landlords are saying or are putting a cap into how many people could live in a room. They're saying, okay, this is the maximum amount of people that you're allowed to live in. So this is also creating a problem. Now, we have to understand another trend that is following this is that the government or the private sector is focusing mostly on these primary cities. For example, in Ethiopia, the focus, be it governmental housing, be it private development, is mostly focused on Addis. This is creating a huge land speculation in the city. Addis is turning into one of the most expensive cities in Africa, if not the most expensive city in Africa. So the trend, or what we're going to see, is that in the future, these African primary cities are going to be one of the most expensive, not only in the region, but even in the world. They are going to be the most expensive cities. Now, this will have a ripple effect on other living costs, but not only that, but on different towns and cities across the nation. So yes, the government needs to think, or all of us has to think a way or a different approach into how can we finance housing, what is even housing, and aspects on this.
Thank you, Bill. I think the idea of turning the question around and focus on how can we reduce migration so that people, the number of people that come to cities primarily be manageable, and that essentially helps manage the housing issue. I think that's an interesting point to pay attention to, and often it also goes into the political nature of many of post-colonial states focusing on urban areas and neglecting the rural areas. So I think that was an interesting point, perhaps to explore further later on. But Antenna, coming to you, Robert mentioned about this idea of people coming to these service quarters and live in there, and they are essentially not scattered by the formal market. I was wondering if you can talk about like the suffers in Addis and the dynamics of life in there as related to how the change in the transformation in housing in Addis is also affecting social life and relationship among people in Addis. I know that at least that's an aspect of your dissertation, so perhaps you can give us a preview to your dissertation as well. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you for the question. I was similar to following the Robel's insight. I was also following Alison's comment, for example, in defining housing or what housing means for the majority poor in an urban community. She mentioned income generation as primary interest of those who are in need of housing, but not the house as an object alone, but housing plus something more. As you also mentioned, as did also Robert, this sense of income generation refers to the economic aspect of issues, but I want to direct our attention to the social capital that is under threat because of development projects that are going on, but also as a possible future directional change or a critical change from policies driven by solely economic or primarily economic policies and planning to those of social capital. Just to emphasize the difference when I say or discussing capital in general, the economic and cultural capital are privately owned for individuals, but what makes social capital different is that it exists in a network of communities. So when we think of development, we have to imagine a network of communities or a community of households and individuals, and the capital that exists in that. So we have to imagine that capital as a possible planning. How can we maximize social capital? What that means is that those people who are living in a community together, they have a sense of security developed. So development projects are threatening the security that exists there. There are a lot of research findings that illustrate in terms of quantified information how many, for example, girls dropped out of school because of redevelopment and relocation to the peripheries, and how many elders were not able to maintain a certain form of life and apparently got ill, or a number of them passed away. So a sense of security, literal security, not only financial, but literal security is being affected because of policies which are strictly or primarily guided by economic principles and economic understanding of issues. So that's why future planning has to integrate or even give primacy to social capital at this point, and imagine new formats of new ways of developing policies. I say this based on some examples, as I mentioned, from the communities. There are a lot of anthropological studies, but also quantitative ones, which illustrate these findings as a result of what I'm referring as the economic policy driven by economic principles and calculations. in general, I can go further detail based on further questions, but I wanted to bring forth this idea of social capital and as it relates in Ethiopian communities in suffers, as you asked me. For example, Iddir is a very critical form of social capital. It can be traced in terms of literal quantifiable capital for communities. And we have to imagine new ways of maximizing that, not even retaining that, but maximizing that social capital that exists among communities. How can we nurture further social, further creation and establishment of further networks on different levels and scales so that this capital gets maximized and people get more security as a result.
Thank you. I guess you end up with a sort of a design challenge, I guess. How can we maximize the networks and social capital? That will lead me to a question about like the role of planners and urban professionals in and what that means as a network of professionals all over the world and their capacity to impose a certain housing regime and types across these countries. But maybe let's park that for a bit. And Gabriel, if you had any reaction to, I know a number of points have been said. I'm still interested in the neighborhood level governance logic. I think that's also something we kind of looked into, because at the end of the day, this comes to individual households, families being affected by one of or the other of this trend. So if we were to scale down this conversation into a neighborhood level, what can we settle? But you can also respond to any of. I know there was a kind of discussion going on between the role
No,
of
I saw some comments on the chat that with argument toward the fact that government should be enablers and facilitators of market and the private sector. But I think it's in a lot of different cases, and South Africa is kind of specific because there is a kind of a welfare state there. If we compare with many other parts of the global South, in Southeast Asia, for example, like in Cambodia, where I've been conducting research, or in Burma, it's clearly totally different. But in most part of the global South, actually, the state is already a huge enabler of the private markets, and the main issue is that the regulation that will actually try to control the action of private stakeholders and their impact on private markets in terms of the growing price of land, speculations, the norms in constructions, etc., is very, very, very low. And this is, I think, the role here of the state to actually promote better regulation. But there is a fight between the idea that the state should not regulate the market because it will create distortions and we won't have private investment, or the other idea that no, actually, if we leave the private developer alone without regulation, he will do he will make decision only for his own interest. So this is huge discussion. But if we go back to your question, what I see in Southeast Asia, like the growing intervention of the private sector and the fact that is producing more and more new kind of neighborhoods, is clearly changing the things on the ground, especially for the governance of the local areas. And someone was mentioning before the role, the importance of the community development of the social capital in creating good living environment, which will also influence housing access and our relations to housing. What I see in Southeast Asia is that the withdrawal of the states, which is actually true whether in very neoliberal state like Cambodia or in a socialist state like Vietnam, has delegated the role of managing local areas and creating a sense of community from the state to the private stakeholders. And now when people have are trying to be citizen and create or participate to the public sphere, one of their main interlocutor is the private sector, the private stakeholder, who is basically in most part in charge of, through management companies, whether third party or themselves, in charge of the place that they have been, that they have created. And the fact that the interlocutor is the state and is not the state anymore, and more the private stakeholder changed the political relations at the local scale. And if we also look at the fact that those private entities are more and more complicated ones, they have sometimes you have a very complex mix of companies, financialized one, international investors, board of stakeholders. It makes very difficult for local people when they have a problem to actually identify to who they have to speak to or to who they have to address the problem they meet. Because, for example, in a project in Cambodia where the main investors are from Singapore, Malaysia, or pension funds from United States, the builders is an Indonesian company, the developers itself is a joint venture at the local scale between a Cambodian and, I don't know, Vietnamese company, let's say. It's very difficult when you are an inhabitant to actually address the issue. You, like, I don't know, the housing that has been produced is not what you have been expected. There is problem in electricity, water drainage, etc., which is actually most often the case than not, because a lot of developers in Cambodia or in Vietnam are actually building very, very bad projects, and in 5 years, it's the local inhabitants face many, many problems. And so it's really without any regulation and with this complex organization of the private stakeholder side, it's very difficult to know at the end to who you can really address the problem you are facing. So this is, I have absolutely no answers, and the other panelists have much more answers than me, but this is something that I've witnessed on the ground.
Yeah, I think that is interesting. Often we talk about like the house, physical property, and not the associated kind of this governance issues, at least not enough in my view. So it was good to hear from you how all these trends of private campers building these condominiums is affecting day-to-day life of the people, including the management of buildings, because I think that's an issue in Ethiopia as well. Like there's affordability challenge, and then to respond to that, the quality of the houses is not that great, and that means like houses that are built even recently are needing maintenance, and then that becomes an issue that's not well thought out in the condominium proclamations, at least in the case of Ethiopia. So that's why I was a little bit more curious about the Asian experience in terms of managing that. Maybe coming back, we'll be finishing, I guess, in 10 minutes or so. So we'll if anyone has any question from attendees, please raise your hand or kind of type your question. I think there were commenters that came through, and we are looking at them, so anyone can kind of respond to those as needed. But if there are specific questions people want to ask, you can either type in your question in the chat function or raise your hand, and we'll give you a mic to ask your question. But Antana, let me come back to your question of planners. I think just to come into a disciplinary notion is I mean, we have to recognize, I don't know how you identify, but you're in the geography department. Alison is more into public policy. Antenna is in the urban planning. And Robel is also architecture, and myself, I'm in the sociology and anthropology field. It's just to show how housing requires, interdisciplinary work and the need to, bring in multidisciplinary teams. But there was also a critique made about, for instance, the Ethiopian condominium houses, and they were imported from German post Second World War experience of German through aid organizations and the role of planners as conductors of that experience in designing and planning. So from social sciences, or at least from anthropology perspective, we tend to be a little bit critical of planners and their tendency to undermine voices that are deemed as non-expert. So what is the role of expertise in all of this housing discussion that we're having? And that's a question I would just throw at all of you, but we'll start from Anton, I guess.
Yeah, I would also use this opportunity to add some things more from the previous discussion. I wanted to introduce, based on your earlier question regarding my research as well. In the end, one of the findings of my research is to, or let's say end results of my research was to properly define and introduce in terms of vocabulary to the way we understand housing, 3 elements. What is called safar in Ethiopia. In English, it can loosely be related to what it means to be a neighborhood, but neighborhood is not sufficient to define what safar is. And this is also discussed in my dissertation, what safar means, both spatially, but also cognized sense of identity, but also in addition to the social capital aspect I mentioned earlier as well. The other notion that I defined and introduced is the Edir as by itself as a network on which social capital is built, but also as an entity itself. So it is a curious case of social capital itself, because it provides network, but also it is itself a social capital. So I introduced that statement. And the third one is the notion of the Gibbi, especially as a typological figure of the Safar, a kind of building element, how physically these ideas manifest in a community. The reason why I am mentioning this, also connecting it back to your question of planners and designers, we need this kind of, my research is also motivated because of this lack of tools, let's say, legitimized tools, recognized tools, because most of our planning and academic discourse is densely populated with notions, as you mentioned one case of, or one example of the German block, housing block migrating, but our academic mechanisms, all the curricula, including a lot of our environment is full of, let's say, the tradition itself is built on imported mechanism, imported thoughts. So the idea or the interest in my research was to establish some social spatial notions into discourse, into academic discourse, and possibly influence policy level discussions, and provide these elements, these thoughts for planners as means to reimagine urbanism and housing in different ways than what we have been doing, as you mentioned earlier. And the anthropological critics are legitimate. So for me, in terms of doing this research, I had to go into anthropology and social sciences to graft some form of methodology that crosses this different disciplines in order to establish these notions. So I hope this also answered your question in a way. From our discipline, by the way, I also cross disciplines in terms of architecture, urban design, and planning because of my educational background. But primarily, I identify as an architect still. In an academic sense, nowadays I am questioning if I am an anthropologist or not. Maybe you can comment on that later on. Later on, meaning privately, not in this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antena. I think that's an important point, like, about the need to accommodate other perspectives. Maybe we'll go to Robel and then Alison and then Robel, and then there are, I think, a couple of questions from either YouTube or the Zoom. So we'll respond to those and we'll wrap up. So Robel, about the education system and expertise in relation to housing, if you have any comment at all. If not, we'll go to the rest of the speakers.
Okay. Well, I'm an urban planner, and like you said, most of anthropologists from the social science department, they usually point finger at the different mistakes urban planning make of this top-down approach that we mostly practice. And yes, we mostly practice in Ethiopia, for example, a top-down approach. And yes, we also point fingers on political leaders. For example, when you talk about condominiums in Addis Ababa, the location as to where to build them is mostly a political decision than an urban planning decision. So what we ended up doing, or what we ended up having, is now we have a densely populated suburban area, which is unique in its own character. It's not a very few people that is living in the suburbs. It's a densely populated area, and the majority of them have to travel all the way to the center part of the city to work, and they mostly have very important jobs, or they're part of the economic cycle of the city. Now all of those people have to travel. When all of those people have to travel back to the city, now we created a massive congestion in the city, something that we haven't observed if you go 20 years or 15 years back. Now, for example, in Ethiopia, the government used to subsidize fuel as a way of trying to control inflation, or try to subsidize living costs in Ethiopia. But now, because we have this densely populated area, people have to move, which means we're spending a lot of, or billions of dollars. The government is spending billions of dollars on subsidizing fuel, which is also a problem considering we only have like $10 to $20 billion of budget on our budget, and they're spending just in Addis alone trying to subsidize fuel. And that is just from a mistake that is because of a mistake in urban planning and in our approach, in our methodology. So like you said, different discussions are needed, different innovative approaches needed. I don't think there is this silver lining or this one approach to the housing problems or the housing problems that we're facing. We have a huge lack of data. We have a huge lack of institutions for politicians to make an informed decision, for planners to work on, using real data. So yes, we need a different. I think my point is that we need to work closely with different professions and different academic perspectives.
Thank you. I don't know if my mic is on. Alison, can you go to, I think the point about lack of data, I think that's something the center also has been emphasizing through its annual report. So maybe that's also worth repeating, but more broadly, I am curious if you are looking into the professional element of challenging or addressing this challenge of affordable housing in Ethiopia. Yes, we know, we talked about the market, we talked about what role the government should play, but how about the human resource? And if you have any comments at all about that.
Yeah, first of all, on the data, in the last few years, CAF has really turned our focus towards building the data infrastructure for the market, for the affordable housing market in Africa, recognizing that investors won't go to an area that they don't understand and can't quantify risk within. So that the more we can surface and make visible through sharing information and making sure that data is credible and is updated, it gives the confidence to investors to move into the space. So we've been focusing a lot on that, both on private data, so data from private developers, trying to gather that and to make it available, not directly related to the project and the company, but available to the market as market intelligence. And then also looking at data that's available from various public sources. In many cases, the data is there, but it's stuck in a government department somewhere in the back and has not been processed and been put online or been made publicly available. And the market misses out if that happens. So in terms of one of our methods of data collection, the yearbook is done annually. And as I said, we have local consultants in most of the countries. We work with about 45 different authors. And in addition to authoring the profile, they also complete for us a survey of about 35 different indicators that we specify for each country. And those are indicators where we need an on-the-ground presence to find out what's happening. So we've done a lot of work within CAF to try to understand what are the key indicators for understanding the market. What are the key things one needs to know about the mortgage market? What do you need to know about demand? What do you need to know about supply to really understand where the country is in terms of the health and the maturity of its housing and housing finance market? So that's a lot of the work that we've been doing. You asked developers, professional development. We work with the University of Cape Town to offer a course on housing finance in sub-Saharan Africa. It's a fantastic course that's done with Wharton in the States. So that's one effort at professional development. We've also converted that course and made a Francophone version available in West Africa, in Senegal. So that's one of the ways that we support professional development in the market. We're also about to launch an online course that will be available for free, that will go through housing and housing finance issues. We're very excited about that. That'll be available on our website, and we've been done it through cooperation with the University of Cape Town and the African Center for Cities. And then in terms of professional development for developers, one of the things that we've dabbled in and haven't been closely involved in, but we have partners who are, is running academies for small scale developers. So bringing in developers or entrepreneurs from the townships who are interested, from low income areas, who are interested in building a few units and renting them out, but they don't know how to go about it. So providing training and building capacity for that kind of small scale landlordism, I think, is a key contribution to the market as well.
About the need to develop multidisciplinary approach, or that was...
Yeah, I was just curious about, on the one hand, I think the need for engaging multidisciplinary teams when we address housing issues, but also since you've talked about private developers coming from elsewhere, you could also, in any way, the role of these different professionals in imposing a certain way of thinking about housing one way or another. If you have any comment related to that,
Yeah, no, we were just mentioning what some people call the dataification of real estate and a housing market. The idea behind that, first we need to make a sense of this market in order to make it accessible for the private sector and private developers. So to create data and to make those markets more understandable especially for international investors, has been a priority, especially from the IMF and the World Bank since the end of the 90s, which goes also with the development of a policy for greater financial inclusion in the 2000s. South Africa is really interesting on that point, because it has been a laboratory for creating data about private real estate market, and this is one of the country that has the biggest database about home ownership and about access to mortgage in the world. So it's kind of a laboratory on that. It's really interesting. What we see again is that this push for datafication has enabled the growing finance, the development and creation of financial instruments to push the access to the poorest part of the population to mortgage and to loans for primary, and that was the main objective of microfinance, for instance, primary to develop like small-scale activity to increase their incomes, but more and more now, those instruments are used to actually finance the access to housing, well, to land, but also to improve housing. The result of this is very, very different from cases to cases. For some households, it has helped them to actually improve their housing, for sure. For many others, it creates indebtedness and a various circle of indebtedness, and for some people, it has actually pushed them into more poverty. But to go back to the need for multidisciplinary approach, for sure, and in housing studies in general, this is what have been pushed forward for some times now, for 5 decades. We need to put at the same table some sociologists, anthropologists, urban planners, public policy specialists, geographers, etc. Because for sure, housing issue in itself hide many other issues. And earlier, someone mentioned that behind housing there is access to proper work, to incomes, and to many other things. And for sure, and if we don't have information on the ground, it's difficult sometimes to realize the priority of the people, the way they are considering houses. And there is actually multiple things we believe about, especially, for example, about informal housing that are actually not true. Like, for example, the idea that when people will get money, they will actually invest on housing primarily. But it's not the case. When we are doing survey on the ground, we see that they are investing in access to education. They are investing in access to healthcare, and actually housing is not a priority for many slum dwellers, for instance. And just to finish on that, about urban planning practices, it is clear that now there is a push for developing knowledge about local practices, how people are actually developing their own knowledge to start from that, and not to start from up to bottom perspective, but more engaging with bottom-up approaches. And it's kind of crazy when we look at the knowledge we have about urban planning practices from, for example, informal areas. We are developing research on informal areas in the past 50 or 60 years, and we still have very, very little knowledge about how people address housing issues at their own scale, on their own neighborhood. And actually, there is plenty of really creative stuff and innovation from people themselves, and this should be the starting point.
To comment,
Hone, your microphone's not on, sorry.
yeah.
Oh, my bad. Apologies for that. But I was just saying, maybe we listen questions from the audience. I think those in the chat, people have seen them, and we will react. But if there are any people who raised their hands to ask Anna, we can, I guess, listen from them now, and then we'll address a question to all the panelists.
Sure. The person with the raised hand has lowered their hand, so I'm not sure if the question's still applicable, but please go ahead again if you'd like to jump in. Just feel free to raise a hand or turn your camera on. We can see you and hear you.
I would like to comment on interdisciplinary, the interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinary approaches that you mentioned, if that's okay.
Yes.
Okay. Definitely there needs to be at least multidisciplines engaging in a common endeavor, let's say. Regarding, because I mentioned earlier also anthropological attempts that I was engaged in, there are already significant traditions in understanding. For example, there is design anthropology and architectural anthropology as disciplines that exist within the larger anthropology discipline as subfields, but as attempts to cross towards the methodological or theoretical spaces of architectural or planning or design as a larger describer of architecture and other subfields, which I find to be interesting, let's say, resources or interesting fields to discover further tools to think, to imagine urbanity and design and planning as it relates to housing as well. I just wanted to drop that, and one on a larger theoretical level also, this discussion on interdisciplinary, disciplinary, multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, and transdisciplinary. Of course, mentioning some words, but and their implication, especially talking about if methodologies are, or let's say theories are being developed within a certain discipline that is interested in conversing or conversating with another discipline, but not really developing a platform where they can operate together towards a certain common language, common communication, but also common outputs. And these discussions also, these 4 types of disciplinary engagement, also I find interesting discussion spaces to see what can happen in the different disciplines at least mentioned and discussed in this session today on an academic level.
Thank you so much, Anton. I guess there was a question about the role of ethnicity in housing and all that. I think person who asked it through YouTube was trying to highlight the issue of corruption, alleged allegations of corruption in Ethiopia, and those corruptions taking ethnic forms. So I think the issue of, we talked about corruption, government, but we didn't really talk much explicitly about corruption. But I think it's worth recognizing that there's the private-public relationship often, yes, it needs to be governed by regulatory mechanisms, but there's always avenues to maneuver that for the interest of either government officials or private companies. So I thought that the issue of corruption, especially in the cases where government is the primary distributor of housing, is also worth paying attention to. I don't think the person who raised their hand is in a position to ask. So maybe at this point, I'll ask the panelists to just give their final remarks, and we'll wrap up. Again, I'll start from you, Gabriel.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to wrap up all of this, but no, I learned a lot today about different different perspective in different cases. And I think that something we did not really address today, but something that we also have to ask ourselves is also to find some way, how to find some way of re-involving citizens in the fight for better housing, which I think now is less active. The civil society in many, not in all part of the Global South, of course. Global South is not really a good category to analyze that. But in many parts of the Global South, clearly there is less and less civil society movement for better housing and greater housing. And this has changed from the past 20 or 30 decades. There is strong civil society organization. The role of internet, the new information technology in creating movement, global movement for better housing is clearly on the rise, but at the local scales, it's sometimes, I think we need also to better think about making housing a social and a political issue again in many parts of the Global South.
Thank you. Thank you. Robel, any final remarks?
Well, housing is a very complex issue. It's a very huge issue in which each of the parameters or each of the elements itself could, we can discuss it for the whole day. When we talk about the financing mechanism, I think I wrote some of the comments on some of my feedbacks on the chat. For example, the Ethiopian government is mostly, or right now, we're mostly focused on trying to attract international investors in order to invest in housing, in order to increase the stock of housing. But we should also look for, local financing mechanisms. So when we talk about finances, there are many innovative approaches that we can follow, and which we should be able to explore. Yes, when we talk about housing, we also need to talk about material, in which, for example, in Ethiopia right now, we're all focused on trying to build concrete block housing units, be it in the cities, be it in smaller towns, or even in rural areas. So we need to find an innovative approach in order to find alternative housing material. When we talk about institutions, we need to develop those. That's how we tackle corruption, by having so many data, by trying to make sure politicians make decisions not based on gut, or rather based on well-informed statistics and well-informed guiding mechanisms. And yes, the key part is we need to involve the society itself. It's not academicians, it's not professionals, it's not politicians that are just driving the housing conversation, that is driving the housing intervention mechanisms. We need to go to the grassroots and talk to people, talk to different communities on what could be done, what could be the practical solutions, and things like that. It's important to note that the global nodes do not figure out the housing mechanisms in a day, in a year, or in a century. It's a process that took many centuries, many eras. So we're struggling because we have to find a solution in a very short frame of time. We're struggling because it is a rapid urbanization that we're trying to control. So we need to continue the discussion, we need to continue the research, and most importantly, we need to involve the society in the trend, in the process.
Thank you, Robel. I'll come to Alison. I guess if you can respond to any point that has been that you wanted to respond to from the previous discussion, but also if you can give us your final so to say message.
Thanks. I think one thing we haven't spoken much about, which I think is also really important to support across Africa, is and sub-Saharan Africa and Global South, would be the rental market. Adequate rental accommodation that's affordable, because it's key to an economy and to a labor force that's able to move around, and to education and student housing, et cetera. So I think that's a key component that probably doesn't get enough attention. I think the main the main area I would like to see all of us talking more about is, as opposed to large housing developments, talking about how we can support small scale developers, how we can support entrepreneurs, and support micro developments. The concept of massive small, which we raised in our yearbook a couple of years ago, that we aren't going to address the housing backlog with massive projects. We're going to address it by lots of small projects, all through the cities, all through areas and towns, and through households. So it's another idea to put forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And finally, Antana, your final messages.
Yeah, I wanted to more or less conclude on the highlighting the need for radically new conceptual frameworks, especially trying to read the majority urban community that is outside of the territory known as, or the territory we understand as to be the West. In general, this kind of categorical reading also needs to be questioned, as was earlier mentioned as well. The Global South itself has its own critics right now, so we have to be more open and flexible in how, or let's say reflexive, to imagine new ways of reading, nuanced way of reading territories such as we discussed today. In our case, for example, the context in Addis Ababa, in South Africa, or in other territories. So a categorical way of discussing. I currently have developed a certain way of refraining myself from even theorizing about Africa itself as a territory, because there are a lot of pixelations to the stories, the politics, the dynamics within the territory that we know as, or the continental territory that we know as Africa. So as challenging as it may seem, I want to urge researchers who might be interested, or let's say public discussants, to work towards a rather non-categorical, inclusive, nuanced, and expansive reading of what we know to be urban, what we know to be housing, what we know to be community and society. And I would also nod and wink towards decolonial theories to further have anchoring theoretical positions in terms of developing confident, clear ideologies that can help us articulate these statements. So in other way, in a long-winded way, I'm trying to say I have a problem with the title of this discussion itself, that uses a global South, but also the term major trends. Trends also is a problem. Sorry, I'm in general trying to encourage young people like ourselves, and those who have clear academic interest in this discussion, to be more brave to discover new ways of reading, new ways of understanding than what has been accepted globally as to be the standard through different mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you, and then I think with that we'll wrap up. Just a final thoughts from myself. I think I struggle with this notion of like global South initially, but I still believe it is, without essentializing those categories. I think we need to pay attention to the relationship those countries have with countries in the global north, particularly in a way how capitalism and neoliberalism shapes a number of facets of life in these countries. Obviously, neoliberalism is just one element, and we have to still contextualize the discussion of the impact of neoliberalism by looking at real examples, real day-to-day practices in countries that I'm referring as global south. But I think there's if we have to go back to radicalizing some of the discussions, I think we have to anchor like the root systems, which often lead us into, the way these countries are related to countries in the global north, and how that relationship often perpetuates inequality and poverty in these countries. That does not mean, that's the only reason. I think today's discussion has shown how within country context and across countries in the global south are also very diverse, and we need a deeper and nuanced understanding of all that. But I think there's also value in scaling out at the developing countries level and see how that relationship with West is also shaping some of the facets of life in the global south. But I think this was, to me at least, a fascinating discussion that demonstrated the power of, bringing these different experiences into one broader title without essentializing it, and also how housing touches upon a number of issues that are and for academicians, how housing might serve as an entry point for a number of other to explore a number of other issues. But I would like to thank all of the panelists who joined us from South Africa. Listen, Robel from Addis Ababa, Antena from the Netherlands, and Sir Gabriel here in Montreal. Thank you for all attendees who joined us. I believe the recording will also be on YouTube, so you will have a chance to watch it or distribute it for anyone you think might benefit from this discussion. Yeah, hopefully with the speaker and with the panelists, we'll continue this conversation in some other shop, but I'm really grateful for you taking the time to join us and share your perspective this morning or evening, wherever you are.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And
thank
thank
you
you,
very
Hone, for bringing together this panel of experts, everybody who's joined us on Zoom and on YouTube as well, for your engagement in the chat throughout. We really appreciate you jumping into this conversation. I mean, we did almost have 100 people registered for this event, so obviously, as Rubel pointed out, the conversation could continue for a full day, if not much longer. So we appreciate all of your ideas and insights here today. Okay, folks, so we're going to wrap it up this time, and hopefully there's moments in the future to uptake this conversation and further it. Thank you so much for your engagement, and until next time, you can revisit the stream on Concordia University's Fourth Space YouTube page. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Bye-bye.